バイリンガルウェブマガジン DIG 東京のディレクターを務めるKAZOOことG KAZOOペニャです。英語力がどんどんつく学習法へようこそ。DIG 東京は8つのカテゴリーのコラムを日本語と英語で併記しているウェブマガジンです。英語力がどんどんつく学習法は僕がこれまでの翻訳や通訳の仕事を通して培った様々な英語上達についてのノウハウをレッスン形式にまとめたもので、読む、書く、聞く、話すという4つのスキルが身につくと思います。DIG 東京のビジネスやライフスタイルに関するコラムのテキストを用いるので、ビジネスですぐに使える英語力や旅行や海外での生活に役立つ英会話力がつきます。DIG 東京のテキストと YouTube の動画を使ったこのレッスンを繰り返すことで、大学受験のための英語力はもちろんのこと、TOEIC、TOEFL、英検などの試験のための英語力もどんどんつくことでしょう。同じコラムの日本語原稿を読み上げた動画シリーズ、Readings for Japanese Study もありますので、興味のある方は動画の下の説明にリンクがあります。では、このレッスンの方法について説明します。まずは、DIG 東京のテキストのページと YouTube の動画をタブや別ウィンドウを使って両方ともすぐ見られる状態にしてください。そうしたら、DIG 東京の日本語のテキストだけをまず先に読んでください。次に、英語のテキストだけを読んでください。英語のテキストでわからない英単語や熟語をネット検索を使って自分で調べてみましょう。もちろんわからない日本語があれば、それもチェックしてください。次に、英語のテキストをもう一度読んでみてください。これで予習が終了です。ここからこの動画によるレッスンを行います。この YouTube の動画を再生させて英語を聞きながら、DIG 東京の英語テキストを黙読してください。次に英語テキストを見ないでこの YouTube の動画だけを見ながら英語をよく聞いてください。最後に YouTube の音声に合わせて英語テキストを音読してください。以上のステップを繰り返すことで英語の表現力、読解力、ヒアリング力、スピーキング力が確実に上達するはずです。2回目以降のレッスンの際にはこの画面の下にあるもっと見るを開いてテキストの朗読のところをクリックしてください。すぐにテキスト本文を読み上げる部分に行けます。今回は Music and Parties 13, The Music of California 5, The Epicenter of the Hippie Movement。コラムニストのミッキー・ケイがヒッピームーブメントについて書きました。楽しみながらレッスンしましょう。1. Prologue。The history of rock music is very closely tied to the hippie movement of the mid-20th century.The hippie movement, in turn, is deeply rooted in the state of California. In the second half of the 1960s, the hippie movement would grow and spread across the U.S., and then germinate around the world. In this article, I will explore where the hippie movement came from, and how its worldview would influence the popular music of the day. 2. The Hip Beatniks.The hippie movement was a counterculture movement that rebelled against the established institutions, traditional values, and social norms that characterized the materialistic Western worldview up until the mid-1960s. Footnote. A counterculture refers to a subculture with values and norms of behavior that are in opposition to those of mainstream society.The term is often used to refer to the counterculture movement that emerged in the U.S. in the 1960s, which espoused alternative lifestyles and rejected things like racial segregation, the Vietnam War, and materialism. Inspired by the movement in the U.S., counterculture movements sprung up throughout the world, especially in Western Europe and even in Japan. The hippie movement largely formed in response to the cultural standards, philosophies, and social environment of the era.It was especially influenced by the Beatniks of the 1950s. Beatnik is a term used to refer to the more superficial aspects of the Beat Generation literary movement, which was popularized throughout the 1950s. Most of the Beat Generation writers had grown up in the so-called Roaring Twenties, the period of economic prosperity and cultural dynamism between roughly 1914 and 1929.Beat Generation writers and their works were characterized by experimental use of drugs, sexual liberation, and other topics that were considered taboo in American society. Older generations looked down upon their antics as anti-establishment and hedonistic. Etymologists believe the word hippie is closely tied to the Beatniks. Hippie comes from hip, a word that today means stylish, up-to-date, and cool. It originated in the 1930s and 40s among African American communities as a term that meant urbane and sophisticated, and was often used in reference to jazz musicians. In the 50s, the term started being used in reference to the bohemian lifestyles of Beat Generation writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg in San Francisco and Los Angeles. 3. Iconic Beat Generation authors and works. Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac was a novelist and poet born in Massachusetts. He is remembered for his autobiographical novels and his improvisational jazz-inspired method of spontaneous prose, purportedly without edits. On the Road. Kerouac's most famous work is considered the sacred text of the Beat Generation, and later the hippies. It is a largely autobiographical novel based on Kerouac's travels across the U.S., and includes many key figures of the Beat movement, such as Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs, represented by characters in the book. Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg was a poet and writer born in New Jersey. He is also remembered as an activist who opposed militarism, materialism, and sexual repression. William S. Burroughs. William S. Burroughs was a writer born in Missouri. He is known for his semi-autobiographical work drawn from his experiences as a heroin addict. The Yahé Letters. Published in 1963, this book is a collection of correspondence and other writings by writers William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. Yahé refers to ayahuasca, a plant found in the Amazon rainforest with mythical hallucinogenic properties. Most of the correspondence details the author's experiments with the drug. Naked Lunch. This 1959 novel by William S. Burroughs is a non-linear tale of a junkie searching for his next fix while evading the police. Based on the author's own experiences, this book depicts drug use, homosexuality, and violence through obscene, controversial language. Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was an American psychologist. As a professor at Harvard University, he conducted experiments as part of his own personal discovery and advocacy of psychedelics. He believed the use of psychedelics could rewire and expand the brain for the better, imprinting a new personality upon the user. The ethics of his research were questioned due to the fact that he took psychedelics together with research subjects and also pressured students in his class to take psychedelics, and he was subsequently fired from Harvard in 1963. In his later years, he became fascinated with computers and the internet, and proclaimed that the PC is the LSD of the 90s. He believed that using computers could also rewire the brain for the better. Footnote. LSD is a powerful hallucinogenic drug often used as a recreational drug for spiritual reasons. The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This is a guide to using psychedelic drugs that was co-authored by Leary with his fellow researchers who had investigated the therapeutic potential of drugs such as LSD and mescaline. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is a Tibetan Buddhist text that serves as a guide for navigating the process of death and rebirth. This book is about how to navigate the experience of ego death while undergoing the psychedelic experience. 4. The Hippie Movement. The influence of the Beat Generation extended into music, films, and beyond. Its currents would converge with other movements like the Civil Rights Movement and the Anti-Vietnam War Movement, and grow into what came to be known as the Hippie Movement. Footnote. The Civil Rights Movement refers to the struggle of African Americans to end legalized racial discrimination, segregation, and disenfranchisement in the U.S. More specifically, it refers to the period of the 1950s and 60s, when acts of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience would ultimately lead to many of the relevant laws being found unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. The movement was led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, and sex in employment practices, and prohibited racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public accommodations. Hippies encouraged free sex and experimentation with drugs under the slogan "Love and Peace." They turned away from the materialistic philosophies of Western civilization and became interested in Eastern philosophies and practices such as Taoism and yoga. Footnote. Taoism is one of China's major religious traditions, alongside Confucianism and Buddhism. The object of spiritual practice is to become one with the Tao, literally the way, and achieve longevity and immortality rather than enter the regular afterlife. The Japanese tradition of Onmyodo, literally the way of yin and yang, draws its cosmological foundations from the Taoist concepts of yin and yang and the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Footnote. Yoga is a group of physical, mental, and spiritual practices which originated in ancient India. Through training your mind and body, it is believed that you can free yourself from material trappings. Bands like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, especially John Lennon, were strongly influenced by these trends. Between the Buttons. This 1967 album from the Rolling Stones features drugged-out cover art that was shot in the early morning after an all-night recording session. The US version includes the classics Let's Spend the Night Together and Ruby Tuesday. Rolling Stone magazine ranked this album 357th on its list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. With their 1966 release Revolver, the 4 Beatles began to shed their boy band image and incorporate drug-related themes and Eastern philosophy into their music. With 1967's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, their various experiments with songwriting, lyrics, studio recording technology, and artwork came together and blossomed into what many would consider the band's greatest masterpiece. The album won a Grammy Award for Best Album in 1968 and was ranked first in Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. The song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is famous for being a song about LSD. 5. The 1967 Summer of Love. The epicenter of the hippie movement was San Francisco, California. The city would host a number of historic rock music concerts that were held in the second half of the 60s, such as Human Bein' and the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. These phenomena would set the stage for the Summer of Love. Footnote. Human Bein' was an event held in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park on January 14, 1967. That brought together various factions of the counterculture under a humanist umbrella. It was a prelude to the Summer of Love and a movement that would culminate in Woodstock in 1969. Footnote. Monterey Pop Festival was a 3-day concert held between June 16th to 18th in 1967 at Monterey County Fairgrounds in California. It became a template for future music festivals, including Woodstock and the numerous rock fests that take place every summer in Japan. Footnote. The Summer of Love is a social phenomenon that occurred during the summer of 1967, when as many as 100,000 hippies converged in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Similar gatherings occurred in New York, Los Angeles, Canada, and Europe, making the counterculture movement a global phenomenon. The hippie movement would reach its peak at the legendary Woodstock Music Festival, which was held in New York between August 15th and 18th in 1969. Footnote. Woodstock was a large-scale outdoor concert held in New York in 1969. More than 30 folk singers and rock bands that defined the era took to the stage to put on a legendary show that became a seminal moment in the hippie and counterculture movements. According to Time magazine, 2 deaths and 2 births occurred during the festivities. Woodstock gave the world some of rock's most legendary live performances. Most people are likely familiar with Jimi Hendrix performance, but I also recommend checking out the other West Coast psychedelic rock bands in the concert documentary. Woodstock, the Director's Cut, 3 Days of Peace and Music. This is the Director's Cut of a 1970 documentary of the Woodstock Festival. It's re-edited and adds a number of key performances to the original. The film won Best Documentary Feature at the 43rd Academy Awards and set the tone for concert films to come. Martin Scorsese is credited as an editor on the film. Footnote. Martin Scorsese is an American film director, screenwriter, and producer. Heavily inspired by the rock music of the 60s, he is known for directing a number of rock documentaries and incorporating rock music into the soundtrack of his films. Footnote. Jimi Hendrix was an American guitarist and singer-songwriter. He fused blues and rock and roll and defined what rock music would become through his musicality and heavily distorted tones. In 2011, Rolling Stone magazine ranked him first in its list of the 100 greatest guitarists of all time. In Japan, Hendrix is referred to affectionately as Jimi Hendrix live at Woodstock. This 2-disc album contains most of Hendrix's performance at Woodstock. His rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner is iconic. 6. New Hollywood and the Hippie Movement. In the second half of the 60s, the influence of the hippie movement would make its way to the silver screen. This would coincide with the end of Hollywood's golden era, the period between the 1920s and the 1960s, when major movie studios had free rein to churn out hits. In their place, new filmmakers would rise in what would be called the New Hollywood movement. Footnote: New Hollywood refers to films produced between the late 60s and the early 70s, depicting anti-establishment characters. The Japanese equivalent is American New Cinema. Easy Rider. In this 1970 film, Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper play two hippies on motorcycles who are presented as tragic heroes who go up against the establishment. Easy Rider. Music from the soundtrack. This movie soundtrack is the perfect companion to a drive down the highway. Footnote: Peter Fonda was an actor from New York. He was born into a show business family. Footnote: Dennis Hopper was an actor, movie producer, and photographer from Kansas. The Strawberry Statement. This 1970 film is based on the non-fiction book by American author James Coonan, which is the first-person documentary of the Columbia University protests of 1968. The film is set in a fictional California university, where a student indifferent to the political upheaval around him is gradually pulled into the student protests. The title is a reference to a statement made by a vice dean at Columbia University. Whether students vote yes or no on a given issue means as much to me as if they were to tell me they like strawberries. Footnote: Ichigo hakushou mou ichido. The Strawberry Statement again. This is a 1975 song performed by the Japanese folk group Bam Bam, inspired by the film. The music and lyrics were written by Arai Yumi, better known today as Matsutoya Yumi. Bonnie and Clyde. Released in 1967, this film depicts the crime spree of bank robbers Bonnie and Clyde from beginning to end, against the backdrop of the Great Depression. The film was considered controversial upon release for numerous reasons, including making criminals its protagonists, depicting being shot to death with graphic realism, and an allusion to oral sex. The Graduate. The Graduate is an American coming-of-age story from 1967. A recent college graduate with no direction in life moves back home, where he is seduced by an older woman, only to fall in love with her daughter. In the iconic last scene, the protagonist crashes a wedding and runs off with the bride in dramatic fashion. However, the final shot is of the two sitting at the back of a bus, the excitement of the moment wearing off, heading toward an uncertain future. Footnote: Dustin Hoffman is an actor from Los Angeles, California. He has won the Academy Award for Best Actor twice. The Graduate. Soundtrack. Simon and Garfunkel's era-defining Sounds of Silence captures a darker side of the sunny 60s, evoking the disconnect between generations and the assassination of JFK. Footnote: Simon and Garfunkel was an American folk duo comprised of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel that came to prominence in the 60s. Rolling Stone magazine ranked them 40th on their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. 7. Epilogue. In this article, I wrote about how the Beat Generation inspired the hippie movement, and how the hippie movement influenced rock music. In the next article in this series, I will go into more detail about psychedelic rock. 以上、Music and Parties 13, The Music of California 5, The Epicenter of the Hippie Movement の英語テキストを朗読しました。いかがでしたか？このコンテンツが気に入ったら、YouTube のこの動画の右下にあるボタンからチャンネル登録をぜひ行ってください。テキストの最後にある Facebook、Twitter、Instagram のアイコンからDIG東京の公式アカウントに入り、フォローしてください。ご意見ご要望がありましたら、YouTube や SNS のコメント欄にご記入ください。www.digtokyo.jp